Hi everyone, this is Fake Life, and this is my streaming tutorial for OBS and Twitch. This tutorial is divided into 6 parts, and you'll be able to click on the individual parts to jump immediately to that section. The first part is what hardware and internet connections needed to stream. The second part is downloading the software you need to stream. The third part is creating scenes and sources. The fourth part is basic setup for people who just want to get a stream off the ground. The fifth part is advanced setup for people who want some more explanations and to understand what's going on and to improve the quality of their streams. And part 6 is how to make high-quality local recordings. Things first. In order to stream, you'll need a fairly good internet connection. Best way to find out what your connection speed is to go to a site like speedtest.net and run a test. If you go there, you should just see a big button at the top of the screen that says to begin a test, and when you click on it, you'll get a result that looks something like this. The first two numbers, the ping and the download speed, aren't terribly important to us for streaming, but the last one, the upload speed, is very important. That upload speed is a measure of how much bandwidth you can send out on your connection for Twitch, streaming with OBS, for online games you're playing, for your chat programs, and so on and so forth. And it's measured in megabits per second, which is the same as 1000 kilobits. So 3500 kilobits, which is the maximum we can send to Twitch, is about 3.5 megabits per second. So that means that if I want to send 3500 kilobits per second to Twitch and have a little bit of extra overhead for the online game I'm streaming at the time and for the chat program that I'm using and maybe an instant messenger or whatever else you may have, then you're going to need a little bit more than 3500 kbps or 3.5 mbps. So what I recommend is if your upload speed is at about 6 or 7 megs per second, then you can stream pretty much whatever quality you want. You're going to have more than enough internet connection to handle the maximum possible upload to Twitch, as well as any other programs you're going to be running. Now, if your upload speed isn't that high, then it doesn't mean that you're not capable of streaming. It just means that you're probably not going to be able to stream at the very highest settings with the highest possible resolution and frames per second and so on and so forth. You can run streams with lower bit rates, and you can run the very minimum I would recommend is somewhere around 800 to 1500 kbps. That's the lowest end I would recommend even trying to stream. If you can't give Twitch at least 800 kbps, that's the cutoff point where I'd tell you don't bother. You're not going to be able to put out something that's watchable. Next comes the CPU. The CPU is actually quite important for streaming. It is the single piece of hardware in your computer that's going to be tested the most when you stream. And you're going to want a fairly fast quad-core CPU. This is one of the very few pieces in your computer that really needs to be good if you're going to stream. If you don't have a really fast quad-core CPU, then if you have a dual-core or something, you might be able to stream, but you're not going to be able to stream games which are really hard on your processor. So something like, let's say, Civilization 5, which is really hard on the CPU, is going to give you problems. But you may be able to stream like browser games and stuff like that without any issues. And one other thing to note is that the CPU and the internet connection can kind of cover up for each other. So if your internet connection isn't the best, but you have a really good CPU, then your CPU is going to be able to do some encoding to make up for the fact that your internet connection is not so good. And on the other side, if your internet connection is good, but your CPU isn't, then you're going to be able to send out the maximum bit rate to Twitch. So even if your CPU isn't the best at encoding, you still may be able to get something that looks pretty good. The third component is RAM. Your RAM is much less important than the first two, the internet connection and the CPU, but it does factor in. And I would recommend you have 8 gigs of RAM. RAM is just so cheap these days that there really isn't much of a good reason not to have 8 gigs. If you only have 4 gigs, you could get by. But you're going to have issues with games that use up a lot of RAM. A really good example of one of those is Minecraft. Minecraft is very very greedy with the RAM. So if you only have the 4 gigs, you may have issues running games like that. If you have 8 gigs, then you're pretty much fine for whatever you want to do. Down at the bottom of this list, you'll notice that the graphics card's not listed. That's because the graphics card really doesn't factor into encoding or anything related to streaming, other than the fact that you actually have to be able to run whatever game you want to stream in the first place. So you probably need at least something that's not onboard graphics, but realistically, you should already know what games run well for you and what games don't. So if your graphics card is capable of handling something like Skyrim with all the mods that you want to stream, then streaming is not going to add any additional load on the graphics card that's going to cause any problems. Getting the programs and the accounts you need to start streaming on Twitch with OBS is very simple. First things first, if you don't have a Twitch account, go to twitch.tv and click on this button here that says sign up. It'll ask you for a username, password, email address, all that kind of stuff. And you fill that information in, you click the sign up button, and you're done. That simple. Next, you need to download OBS. And to do that, you just go to obsproject.com and you click on the big green download button. And that's going to automatically start up a download for you. You download that, you run it, and that's that. You're totally set up on all the software and all the accounts you're going to need to stream. Once you have OBS installed, it's going to look something like this, except obviously you're not going to have a stream actively open and doing things in this window. The first thing you'll need to do when you get started is you need to create a scene. It's very simple. You just go to this box under scenes here, you right click, you say add scene, and you put in a name for it and you're done. It's that easy. The scene doesn't do anything other than serve as a collection of sources. And the sources here are game captures or monitor captures or images, overlays, scrolling text, and so on and so forth. To create a source, you right click on the box underneath sources and you click on add, and you're going to see a number of options here. These are the various sources you can use to display whatever you want to on the screen in OBS. We have window captures for just a window, like for example the OBS program itself. We have monitor captures that capture everything that happens on a monitor, which is what I'm using here. We have game captures, which capture what's going on in a game, and then we have a few other options like still images, image slideshows, text, video capture device if you have a webcam, and so on and so forth. Let's start by adding a game capture. You can enter the name of your game capture, whatever you want here. I'll just leave it as game capture. And this is the screen that's going to come up when you try to create a game capture. First thing here is the application. This is going to display a list of all the applications you currently have running. So if you're running a game, then your game is going to show up here and you click on it. Beneath that, you can use a hotkey to turn the scene on or off if you want. As you can see, we don't have one set up at the moment. And then there's a bunch of stuff to change the size of it. You can stretch the image to the screen. You can capture the mouse cursor if you want to show the mouse cursor moving around on the screen. You can invert cursor on click so it changes color whenever you click on it if people need to see that. And that should be it. If what you want to capture is in a window, like for example you want to show something that's on YouTube or a browser-based game, you click on add again and go to window capture. Enter a name for it. And at the top, once again, you're going to see a drop-down of all the windows that are currently open, so you can pick it. You can choose if you want to see the inner window or the entire window, which is basically, do you want to see the top bar that displays at the top of the application as well or not? You can capture the mouse cursor again. You can change the gamma of the window. You can set the opacity of it. And you can select sub-regions. So if you only want to capture a small portion of the screen, what you would do is you would click on sub-region, and then you would either enter the starting position, the upper left-hand corner up here, and the sides of the window, or you'd click on select region. And when you click on select region, you're going to see a box come up. So let me give an example. I have a folder for my OBS recordings here. So if I'm capturing this window and I only want to capture a small portion of it, I'll click on select region and it's going to pop up this box that I can resize around, so I can only capture a tiny portion of it. However I want to resize it. And then you hit escape, enter, click outside the rectangle when it's complete. And that's all there is to window captures. Next comes monitor captures. And monitor captures can potentially cause you some problems. Again, you do the same thing here. You right click here, you go to add, you click in the monitor capture, you tell it what you want to do. And here, instead of a drop down of programs that are open, you just pick a monitor. And that's going to show you everything that's up on the monitor. It shows you absolutely everything. The rest of this is going to look pretty much the same as the window capture. You can change the opacity, you can take only a sub-region, and so on and so forth. The issue you can potentially run into with monitor capture, and the reason why I don't recommend monitor captures unless you absolutely have to show the entire monitor, is monitor captures can cause you issues if you're running Windows 7 or Vista. The problem is, if you're using Aero in Windows 7 or Vista, which is that Windows functionality that gives you this fogged glass look that looks nice in all these programs, then Windows won't let you record your desktop in Aero at anything more than 22 frames per second. I don't know why, that's just how it works. So if you're running Windows 7 or Windows Vista and you have Aero turned on and you try and capture your desktop, it's going to be 22 frames per second. Now, the obvious solution to some people might be just turn off Aero. But there's another problem there, because if you turn off Aero, you'll get your 60 frames per second back, but you're going to see screen tearing. And screen tearing is essentially whenever the window needs to update the image in it, it's going to do it line by line. It's going to replace the image with whatever it needs to for the next frame, and it keeps doing that over and over again. Screen tearing is what happens when it's not quite in sync, and you're going to see these little lines appearing where it's in the process of updating, and you'll see lines where it's working on updating something. It's something that only some people notice. Some people are never going to see it, and it's not going to cause them issues, and some people are going to see it and it's going to drive them crazy. So that's why I suggest, if you're using Windows 7 or Windows Vista, if possible, avoid using monitor captures. If you do need to use a monitor capture, then either accept the fact that it's going to be 22 frames per second, or turn off Aero and you're going to get a little bit of screen tearing, but you'll get your 60 frames per second. And as an added note, if you're running Windows 8 or 8.1 like I am, then monitor captures are fine, you can use them. You won't run into any issues. Next, I'll show the video capture device real quickly. I won't be able to go into too much detail because I don't have a webcam, but you'll see that it's got a drop down just like all of our other sections. You can configure it, which is going to pop up all of these windows that, well, in my case, they aren't going to show much of anything because I don't have a capture device. You can set the resolution. You can use a chroma key if you want to do a green screen behind you or something like that. You can change the audio of it, and you can change the gamma and all that kind of good stuff. So, since I can't show you that, you'll have to play around with that a little bit yourself, but I'm sure you can find a tutorial online for that. Other than that, you've got a few more options. You can put images, which is how I'm using these pictures, like the speed test picture right there. You can do an image slideshow, which it's a slideshow. Every few seconds it goes from one image to another, and you can configure all that. You can set up text, which includes scrolling text. And you can set up global sources that are available to all of your scenes. So if you create it once, you can put it in every scene. And that sums up scenes and sources. It's mostly fairly simple. Just remember that a scene is just a collection of a bunch of sources. and your sources are going to be whatever you want to display. So I'll have a monitor capture for my game, and I'll have an image over the top of that, which is my stream's overlay, and I'll have scrolling text at the top of the screen for all the people who've donated to me and all that stuff, and so on and so forth. If you're streaming a game that has a client window and a game, for example, League of Legends. League of Legends has a client that opens up in its own window, and then it's got an actual game. What you would want to do to capture that is you're going to need to make a window capture for the client, and you also make a game capture, and you capture the actual game that's being played. So a little bit more complex, but it's not too big of a deal. Other than that, you should be able to get pretty much everything you need up and running with just window captures, monitor captures, and game captures. Now that you've gotten to this point in the video, it's time to decide if you want to watch the basic version or the advanced version of OBS Setup. The basic version is recommended for people who just want to get a stream off the ground and don't want to mess with things like tweaking their stream to get little bits of extra performance out of it, and don't necessarily want to know exactly how everything works. The advanced version is going to give you everything. I'm going to teach you how to mess with advanced settings, we're going to work with custom encoder settings, and I'm going to explain exactly how everything works and what some of these numbers that I would just blindly tell you to put in the basic version actually mean. So there will be 2 buttons that you can click on here, and if you just want to see both versions, keep watching. Okay, basic setup. First things first, click on settings, click on settings. I'm going to load up one of my profiles here for my online streaming. If you want to, then you can create a profile to save all of this to. If you don't want to, don't worry, it's going to save everything for you. There's nothing in here you need to mess with. Alright, now we're in the encoding tab. First things first, make sure that use CBR is checked. Has to be checked, which requires it. Enable CBR padding is checked. Custom buffer size is unchecked. Quality balance we don't mess with. Max bit rate. So your max bit rate is going to depend on what your speed test says. So let's say I'll pop up my speed test window again. My speed test window shows that I've got an upload speed of 11.76 megabits per second, which means that in theory, I'm totally fine streaming up to the maximum Twitch allows, which is 3500. So I'll show you that. This number right here can be as high as 3500. That is the biggest number that Twitch is going to allow you to put in there. And just a note, if I make a change here to something that Twitch doesn't like let's say I put 4000 as my bitrate here, I can click apply, and if I go to the broadcast settings button, then OBS is going to say, hey, just so you know, you're not following Twitch settings. You need to set your encoder to a maximum of 3500. So OBS kind of protects you from changing things in ways that Twitch doesn't like. Now, even though I can go up to 3500, the reason I've got this set to 2500 is because I still need to allow people who are watching my stream, they have to download whatever I'm uploading. So if I make my bitrate too high, people with very slow connections may not be able to watch my stream. This is normally not a really big problem, but just so you know, if people are watching your stream over in Singapore, or they say they're having troubles watching you, then it may be because you're uploading too much stuff. The other thing is, if you have a bandwidth cap on your connection like I do, then you may not want to use your entire bitrate because it can make sure that the recordings get a little big. So you can put whatever number you want here, and just to give you an idea of what you can do with each bitrate, I'll pop this up. So if you want to stream at 1080p, you are at the very least going to want to put in 2500, and realistically, if you want to stream at 1080p, just to be frank, I would not put in a number smaller than 3500. 3500 is kind of enough to stream at 1080p and kind of not. So if you want to stream at 1080p, I would highly recommend you put 3500 in there if your internet connection is capable of it. And you're also going to want to tweak your CPU settings some, probably, if you want to make sure it looks real nice. And if you want to know more about that, go to the advanced settings. 720p is kind of a good catch-all speed. A lot of games don't really require 1080p. And you can run 720p as low as 1600 and all the way up to the max if you want to make your 720p look real nice. And again, you can tweak it a little bit in the CPU if you want, and that's in advanced settings, but for most people with pretty reasonable internet connections, I would recommend sticking with 720p. Now, if you have a slower connection, you can run 480p and 360p. And I've got those numbers up there in case you have a very slow connection and you want to stream, but it's going to be rough, honestly. You can run 480p, like it says on the screen, at 800 to 1600, and that's about as low as I would recommend streaming, because once you go below 480p, things start getting really hard to see and read. If you really must get a stream up, you can try running 360p at like 500 kbps to about 1000, but it's not going to be pretty. But you can give it a shot. The other thing that a lot of people want to mess with is their FPS. And I'll show you where the FPS is. That's going to come in the future. But one thing to know is that 60 FPS is actually really demanding. So if you want to stream 60 FPS, even at 720p, I wouldn't set your bitrate lower than 2400 or your 60 FPS is not going to look good. The bitrates that I listed above that, the 2500 to 3500 for 1080p, but realistically 3500, and the 1600 for 720p, those numbers are fine for 30 FPS. If you decide you want to bump things up, what I would recommend is you tweak slowly. Go to 40, go to 45, go to 50. A lot of people aren't going to be able to see the difference between a good 50 and a 60, or a 45 and a 50. So I would bump up things bit by bit. And if you have any issues with streaming, if you're not giving it enough bit rate to do what it wants to, then you're going to see drop frames. Let me go back to OBS for a second. So if you're streaming and you're not giving it enough bandwidth to do what it wants to, you're going to see dropped frames here. As you can see, right now we're fine. I'm running locally, it's kind of different. But this is going to pop up, it's going to tell you, hey, you're dropping frames. And a message is going to pop up here saying, I can't encode everything you want me to encode, we're dropping frames now. So if you try to shoot for the moon and go 1080p, but you're only giving it like 2500 kbps or something, then you're probably going to end up dropping frames. So make sure whatever bandwidth you put in, however much bitrate you're sending to Twitch, you put in a realistic resolution and frames per second setting that you can actually handle. For audio encoding, codec, I would just use AAC. Bitrate, just go ahead and put in 160. Twitch won't let you go any higher than 160, and that's not a big deal for most connections. The audio is not the big problem. Broadcast settings. Simple version. Mode, set it to live stream. Streaming service, set it to Twitch or Justin TV if you're streaming on Twitch. There's a lot of options here if you want to stream on something like Owned or Hitbox or anything like that. It's all here. Server. So you're going to have to pick a good encoding server, and for the simple version, I'm just going to tell you, pick the server that's closest to you. If you have issues with it, you can move to a different server, but just pick a server that's close. Your stream key. Your stream key is a big long code that you get from Twitch that's going to tell you what to put in there. So let me open up a window here. And go to bookmarks. Let me log in. You want to go to twitch.tv/ whatever your username is, whatever you put in, that's mine, /dashboard/stream key. And it's going to send you here. And there's a button here that says show key. You're going to click on it, and whatever it pops up is what you put in that stream key field. Now, I'm not going to show you mine because that stream key is all anyone needs to stream as you on Twitch. So if you share the stream key with your friend, people are going to be able to stream as you. They're going to be able to kick you off your connection and stream as if they were you. If you show this on a stream or on a video or something, then everyone who was watching that video can now log on to your Twitch and stream as if they were you. So that's the reason I'm not clicking on this button. But you should get your stream key, put it in OBS. And that's that one. Auto reconnect. It's just a checkbox. If Twitch disconnects, it's going to try to auto reconnect. And auto reconnect timeout is how often it's going to try to auto reconnect. Default is every 10 seconds. Go ahead and leave those on, leave that at 10 seconds. Delay, just if you need to play, if you're playing some game where you want to set up a stream delay, say you're playing StarCraft and you don't want someone to stream cheat you, this is where you put the delay in seconds. For most people, it's not an issue, but if you need to, it's there. You can set up a hotkey to turn your stream on and off. Don't bother with that. You can also have it save a file while you're streaming. So in addition to streaming, it will also save a file to whatever file path you send it to. So you can mess with that if you want to. Video settings. So your graphics card, whatever you're using for your video adapter, is going to be here. Your base resolution is going to be the size of the monitor you're streaming on. You can either put it in manually, or you can just pick a monitor and say use whatever that monitor's resolution is. Not a problem. Now here's important stuff. Resolution downscale. If you want to stream at something lower than 1080p, this is where you do it. For example, my monitor is 1920 by 1080. This second number means it's 1080p. I can stream in 1080p. But I don't want to. So I've got a resolution downscale set. The resolution downscale is going to set whatever resolution you have here and do little multipliers on it. So I've got the max possible is 1920 by 1080, which is 1080p. And then 1.5 here will give you 720p. It's the second number. If I want to stream at 480p, that's this option, 2.25. And 360p is all the way down here at 3.0. So figure out what resolution you want to stream at, put it here. Filter. You can go ahead and set this to, I'll probably butcher this, Lanczos. I don't know how you pronounce it. This is not a very big deal, just set it. FPS, put in a number there. You're not going to be able to put in a number greater than 60. And you shouldn't anyway. So just put in your FPS there. Audio. Don't even mess with this unless you want to set up a push-to-talk hotkey, have a delay on it, or mute or unmute your mic. Don't mess with it. Advanced tab. I know this is basic, but there's a couple of things we have to do here. First things first, don't mess with general. This is outside of our league. Don't mess with it. Video. Your X264 CPU preset, just set it to very fast. Don't ask why, this is the basic version. X264 encoding profile needs to be main. If you don't set it to main, Twitch is going to complain at you. Don't ask why, just do it. Keyframe interval must be set to 2. Again, it's a Twitch requirement. Check use constant frame rate. That is what CFR is. Custom X264 encoder settings. For the basic version, you will not check this, you will not use any of these. Do not mess with it. This is where all the magic happens, and you can really, really make your stream look terrible and really put a lot of load on your CPU if you don't know what you're doing. Don't allow 61 to 120 FPS, we don't care. And don't mess with these audio or network things. Noise gate. If you want to set up a noise gate instead of a push-to-talk hotkey, you can see it's matching what my voice is doing right now. Basically, what's going to happen is whenever I talk, it's going to push this bar up, and these are the thresholds for the noise gate, which is currently disabled because I have this open. But this number is the automatic threshold at which we're going to close the microphone. If it ever goes below this, then we're going to close it. And if it goes above this, we're going to open it. If you want to use the noise gate, click it and follow these directions here. So when we get out of this window, just to show you, if you look at the OBS here, when I'm talking, everything's fine. But when I stop talking, the threshold is going to go down, and once we get to a certain point, when I stop talking, it's just going to cut off completely. Just like that. And that is it. You will not have the server ping because that is an additional add-on I have. And that is how to get a very basic Twitch stream off the ground. Test it. You can click on Preview Stream, this button here, which will be enabled if you're not actively streaming. The microphone buttons here will allow you to mute your microphone or mute the sound from everything else on your computer. And you can click on Start Streaming when you're good to go and have one of your friends look at the stream and tell you, yes, it's working. And that's it. You are done. You have a Twitch stream. Congratulations. If you want to know a little bit more, stay tuned for the advanced version. Okay, advanced tutorial. If you're here, it means you want to tweak your stream, get the most out of it. You want to know why we're setting the settings the way we are. And you want to know what all these weird terms and acronyms mean. So let's get started. We'll go into settings, click on settings. In the general tab, you can set up a profile. I've got multiple profiles. I'll explain why when we get to the differences between the profiles. And I'll show you my low motion profile. Other than that, you don't need to mess with anything here. Encoding. This is the first part of adhering to Twitch guidelines. The use CBR must be checked. CBR means constant bitrate. The reason why this is checked, what it does is it makes it so our stream is always going to use a bitrate that is close to whatever this number right here is. Not exactly, but close. We'll get to the not exactly in the advanced tab. The reason we're doing this is because without using constant bitrate, what a lot of people were doing was they were setting a really high bitrate on their stream, like 7,000 or 10,000 or something like that, and turning off the constant bitrate. And what happens is they were running games that were very fast, something like a Need for Speed or something like that. And when they were showing still shots, you'd get a really, really low bitrate being used. For example, in this little demo here, as you can see, I'm not using very much bitrate. We're hovering around the 3 digits. Now, when you get to a scene where everything moves a lot, you can go up really high. Like, for example, if I start moving this around a lot, you'll see that the bitrate's going to jump up to like the 3,000s, the 4,000s, and then it's going to calm back down. Basically, that's what Twitch was trying to avoid, was people having these streams where the really, really slow parts were very low bit rates, and the really fast parts were really high bit rates, because it's very difficult for Twitch to handle that. And in addition, a lot of people with slower connections weren't actually able to watch streams because people had their bit rates so high that their download wasn't good enough to do it all. So we leave constant bitrate checked. And as a note, if we do turn it off, Then when we go to broadcast settings, OBS is going to give us a little warning down here. This little red text that says, hey, your OBS settings aren't going to work with Twitch. They're going to throw a fit. And they tell you, this enables CBR, you need to enable that. So OBS has got your back. They'll tell you if what you're doing is incorrect. Now, we'll mess with these options a little bit more when we're making local recordings, because local recordings, we can mess with this. Like what I'm doing right now, we're totally fine. Your bitrate is going to be based on your upload speed. Now, we've already been over how to find out your connection speed. That was this speed test picture. Close this window. This speed test picture. So my upload speed is 11.76 megs per second, or about 11,000 kbps. That means that if I go here, I could in theory put a number in here up to 11,000. However, that would cause problems because if I'm playing an online video game, or if I'm using an online chat program, or browsing the web while I stream or something like that, I'm using all of my bandwidth on streaming, so things are not going to work right. So there's a practical limit on how much of your bandwidth you actually want to put in here. If you want to be really, really safe, put in at most about half. And you can only go up to 3,500. So in my case, I could safely put in a number like 5,000 or 6,000 and not run into any issues. But Twitch doesn't, they don't want to have any of that. I can only put in up to 3,500. The reason I have 2,500 in here is because I'm running into issues with the bandwidth cap. I can only upload so much every month before they start charging me extra. So I don't use all of the bitrate that Twitch allows me, but I've got some settings at the advanced tab, and basically my CPU is going to cover up for the more limited use of my connection. And I'm going to show you how to do that too. We don't really get a mess with these other settings like quality balance because we are using constant bitrate. Again, that's local recording stuff. Buffer size, we don't use a custom buffer size. That's something we will mess with for offline recordings. Audio encoding. You can use MP3 or AAC. If you use AAC, the maximum bitrate that Twitch is going to allow you to put in is 160. You can go higher than that, but for the most part, the audio is not the super stressful part. Just go ahead and leave that at 48 Hz stereo. If you want to use MP3, there's a different max bit rate. I'm trying to remember what that is. 128. Yeah, so your audio bit rate, if you decide to use the MP3 codec, can only go up to 128. Using different codecs is something you mostly aren't going to have to worry about too much. If depending on your, editing software, it may make a deal, but I wouldn't worry about it. Just use AAC, and you can safely set your bitrate up to 160, unless you have a ridiculously slow connection. That shouldn't cause you any problems. Broadcast settings. Mode is going to be live stream because we're live streaming. The streaming service, you can put whatever you want in here. You can go to Twitch, you can go to Hitbox, Dailymotion, a number of sites. We're going to do Twitch. Server. So normally you just pick the server that's closest to you here. The better way to do this is to test your ping, and there are two ways to do this. The first way to do this is to download an external program that's going to tell you what the ping to all these Twitch servers is. There is a forum on teamliquid.net that has an application you can download that's going to show you your ingest latency. It's going to show you your latency at each of these servers. That's good and all, but the better way of doing it is going to be to get an actual plugin for OBS. You can get it on the OBS forum right here. I'm going to provide a link in the description. And all you do is you click on download latest version and you follow the directions here. Depending on if you're using 32-bit or 64-bit, you're going to need to put the plugin in a different folder. But Other than that, it shouldn't cause you any issues. And once you put that in there, you can close OBS and start it up again, and you'll have server ping here like I do. Now, when you have server ping, you're going to see all of these different streaming services and all of these different servers you can connect to. So here's the whole block of Twitch stuff. You can see the Vaughn, you can see Good Game, Cyber Game, Hitbox, which is fairly new. And what you're looking for here is you want a server that's got as low of a number as possible in average and as low as possible a number in jitter. The average is the ping. The ping is how long it takes for you to get a signal to that server and back. And as you can see, the fastest one for me is the Ashburn, Virginia. The jitter is a measure of how stable the connection is. Basically, they're measuring the best pings you've gotten against the worst pings you've gotten, and they're giving you a rating of it called the jitter. So the more stable the connection is, the better. And as you can see, again, Ashburn, Virginia is very good. I could, in theory, try and stream to something ridiculous like one in Moscow, but as you can see, we'd have some issues with that. We have very bad connection to Moscow. So I'll see in here that Ashburn, Virginia is where I want to go, and we put in Ashburn, Virginia. Next is the stream key. The stream key is very appropriately named. It is a key. It is what allows you to get in to start streaming on your Twitch account. The way you'll get there is you will go to twitch.tv/whatever your username is, /dashboard/streamkey, and you'll click on this button that says Show Key, which I am not going to click on because the stream key, it's what you put in here, and anyone who has access to that stream key has access to stream as you. If you are streaming, they can boot you off your stream at any time, take over your stream, and put on pictures of them twerking or whatever. So you do not want to share that stream key unless you are 100% comfortable with people messing with your stream, streaming stuff on there and saying they're you. So don't give that out. But in order to get it, you click in that, you go to that link I put down in the description, and you paste it here. That's all you need to do. Auto reconnect. Check that. That's basically if your OBS disconnects, it's going to try to auto reconnect you. And the auto reconnect timeout is how often it's going to attempt to do so. So every 10 seconds, it's going to try to auto reconnect. That's all fine. Stream delay. If you're playing a game like StarCraft 2 where you don't want people to be able to snipe your stream and watch you and see what you're doing in the game and you want to put a delay on here, that's where you do it. Minimize network impact. This is not an option you need to mess with for like 99% of people. I mean, it's not something we're going to fiddle with. Dashboard link, if you want to link to your dashboard. I don't think this is used for anything in Twitch. Save to file, if in addition to broadcasting you want to save this to a file on your hard drive, you click here, you put in a file path, and you're done. And if you want to set up hotkeys to start your stream or end your stream, you do that here. So video. Your video adapter is going to be your video card, which goes up here. Your resolution is going to be the resolution of your monitor, and you can either put that in manually, like I've done here, or you can give it a monitor and your computer will take the resolution of that monitor and make it your base resolution. So that's all good. So resolution downscale and FPS. This is where you're going to set the quality of the stream in terms of resolution and frames per second. So you remember this number we put in here. That's going to determine what we can stream. Let me hop on over to our bitrate screen. So what I would recommend is if you want to stream 1080p, up there I've said you can stream as low as 2500 kbps, but realistically, if you want to stream 1080p, put in the max possible bitrate, go 3500. And you may also want to put in some CPU tweaks as well to make it look good, and we'll mess with that in the Advanced tab. I would not do stuff in 1080p unless you're going to give it the full 3500. It's debatable that even 3500 really isn't quite enough to do 1080p. For most of us, for the rest of us, 720p is probably going to be good enough for most of your games. A whole lot of games don't actually need to be 1080p. So whatever you're streaming, actually know what the quality of the game is. If I'm streaming a game like Blood Bowl, there is zero need for me to stream in 1080p. It's basically a tabletop miniatures game. I don't need fancy animations in my tabletop miniatures game, so I stream that at 720p. If you're using something like a Halpage capture card to capture your PlayStation 3 games, the Halpage can only capture games at 720p anyway, so there's no need to do 1080p. If you're using a Halpage to capture Xbox, on the other hand, you can do 1080p if you want. PlayStation is only 720p. And if you're doing 720p, you can do it as low as 1600, but you can, in theory, crank it all the way up to 3500 and still get improvements out of your 720p stream. So that's part of the reason I recommend it, is even at the max bitrate, you can make 720p look really, really nice. And we'll tweak that a little bit in the advanced settings, and you'll see how we do that. If you got a slow connection, then you can go down to 480p or 360p. I don't recommend going below 480p because at 360p it really, really starts looking very blurry and hard to read and hard to see what's going on. But if you must, there's the bit rates I recommend for 480p and 360p. For the frames per second, if you actually want to stream at 60 FPS, then don't stream below 2400 kbps because it will not look good. 60 frames per second is incredibly stressful, much more so than you might think. It's going to cause issues. So, if you're going to do it, give it at least 2400. If you're doing 1080p at 60 frames per second, 3500 kbps, no questions asked. Just put it there, and you're still going to be fighting to make it look as good as you possibly can. The specifics I give up here, the 2500 or 1080p, the 720p, 1600, and so on and so forth, those are good values for 30 FPS. If you want to speed things up a bit, I would recommend your first step be go up to 40 or 45 and crank in a little bit more bitrate in there. And give it a shot, see how it runs. A lot of people, like 30 to 40 to 45 isn't a big deal. 45 to 50 is a bit more of a jump that some people can notice, and definitely going up to 60 is a noticeable thing. 60 frames per second looks nice. It looks clean, but it is so stressful that I don't often recommend it. And again, make sure that the game you're running is actually worth it, because Blood Bowl, tabletop miniatures game, no reason whatsoever to stream it at 60 FPS. All you're going to do is send extra bandwidth out to make an ugly looking game still look ugly, and you're going to make it harder on people to watch because you're sending out more bitrate than some people with slower connections might be able to handle. There is no need. So know your game, know exactly what you want to stream at, and figure out a good bitrate. If you are streaming and you're having issues with how much bitrate you give it as in relation to the resolution and the frames per second, you're going to see it down here. If you're not giving enough bitrate for the encoder to do what it needs to do, you're going to get drop frames here. And drop frames mean basically it just gives up. It says, I don't have the bandwidth I need to do what you're asking me to do. I'm just going to have to skip some frames to keep up. And that is what drop frames are. In addition, you will also see a warning here that says, hey, I'm trying, but we're going to have to skip some frames because I cannot keep up. So Now that we've talked about what settings you might want to use, and maybe you have a good idea in your head of what resolution and frames per second you want to use, this is the screen where you set them. My base resolution for my monitor, as you can see, is 1920 by 1080. The second number is the resolution, so this is a 1080p resolution for my monitor. That means I can stream at 1080p if I want. I don't, I'm streaming at 720. The way we control that is in the resolution downscale. The resolution downscale is a multiplier that affects these numbers here. So if I take my 1920 by 1080 and I divide it by 1.5, then we're going to get this resolution here, which is 1280 by 720. And since the second number is 720, that means it's 720p. If we want to stream at 480p, we would pick 2.25. And if we wanted to stream at 360, again, I don't recommend it, but if you want to, you'd go all the way down here to 3. You can stream at these weird intermediate resolutions like 864p and stuff like that, but I would honestly just stick to 1080p, 720p, and so on and so forth. Filter, just pick this Lanczos. It's going to default to the bicubic sharpener. You can safely set it up to Lanczos. This is not a terribly stressful setting, so go ahead and do it. And FPS, whatever you decided you want to, you just put in here as a number. I would recommend sticking, you can put in weird numbers, you can put your stream at 59 frames per second if you want, but I would stick to numbers like 30, 40, 50, 60, 45, fairly good stable numbers. Half of 60, 2/3 of 60, and so on and so forth. Disable arrow. We talked about this a little bit with the captures when you're monitor capturing. If you are using Windows 7 or Windows Vista and you absolutely must do a monitor capture, and it is a problem that it's only 22 frames per second, you can disable this. Otherwise, don't mess with it. It's going to cause screen tearing, which looks ugly, and some people are going to notice it, and it can be obnoxious for people who can see it. Since I'm using Windows 8, actually 8.1, we can't disable arrow. But then again, I don't have that problem. That is solved in Windows 8. But if you're using 7 or Vista, then this button is a last-ditch effort if you must monitor capture, and it must be faster than 22 frames per second, then you can disable arrow here. Audio tab. So for the most part, we are not going to mess with too much stuff here. Your desktop audio device, your microphone or auxiliary audio device, if you're having issues where it's not recognizing your sound, you can make sure that you've got the right device set here. For example, my microphone, I'm using a Blue Snowball, but default is working fine. So I don't need to mess with it. Have it only show connected devices because I don't want it to show me stuff that's not connected anymore. If you want to use a push-to-talk hotkey, you put that here. You can have a delay in milliseconds. If you want there to be a slight delay between when you push the button and when push-to-talk happens, you set that up here. I use a noise gate, so we don't mess with push-to-talk hotkeys. I will show you the noise gate shortly. You can mute and unmute your mic, and you can mute and unmute desktop. That is these settings down here, which currently look like they are muted because I have my low motion profile selected as opposed to local recording. If I go to local recording for a second, you'll see that I've got my microphone sound here and I've got my desktop sound here. You can tweak it up and down by clicking. As you can see, I will tweak this down a little bit. You can mess with the percentages if you want to, or you can completely mute them. My desktop isn't putting out any sound, but I can mute it if I want to. And if I mute my microphone, you wouldn't be able to hear me anymore. But that should be it for the audio tab. Force your microphone to mono if you need to for some reason. I can't imagine why you would need to force your microphone to mono, but there it is. And you have microphone boosts and desktop boosts if things aren't loud enough. and we don't mess with you don't mess with most of this tab, honestly. It pretty much works out of the box unless it's not finding your microphone at all, and then you can fiddle with it here. So next is the Advanced tab. This is where all the magic happens. First things first, use multi-threaded optimizations. Leave it unchecked. If you're using a modern computer, for the most part, you don't need to have OBS do its own multi-threaded optimization stuff. If you have a very, very bad computer you're trying to stream with, and you're having a lot of issues, you can try it, but for the most part, like 99% of people don't need to mess with this. Process priority class. This is the same thing as if we were to press Control-Delete, open up the task manager, and set a priority to the program. Now, in there, you can set a lot more stuff, like you can go up to real time and stuff like that, but you don't want to. There is no reason to go any higher than above normal, and if you go higher than high, even if you go to high, you are potentially hogging cycles from programs that really probably kind of actually need them. But if you set it to above normal, then you're kind of making sure that stuff like your antivirus programs may not, or that the OBS gets the cycles before stuff like antivirus does. You know, programs like that. So I would set this to above normal, and I would leave it there. Scene buffering time. You only mess with this option if someone who knows what they're doing in OBS, like an OBS expert, is trying to help you debug a problem, and they tell you to mess with this. The same with these other ones. Disable encoding while previewing. Don't mess with these unless someone who knows what they're doing tells you to mess with these. This will default at 700, just leave it there. Video. X264 CPU preset. Basically, the X64 CPU preset is it's a set of preset values that the encoder is going to use when it's encoding stuff. Let me open up a window for us here. So this is going to be a little bit over your head for now, but I'm going to show it to you just to kind of show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. The X264 codec has a number of settings. You can see ultra fast, super fast, very fast, faster, and so on. And each of these is going to set some values for these parameters. So badapt in very fast is 1. Keyframes in very fast is 3. ME in very fast is hex. So when you set a preset, it's telling it exactly what to use. And some of these are the same no matter what you do. Now, the trade-off here is quality versus speed. So very slow is going to have the highest quality, and ultra fast is going to have the lowest quality. Despite that, very fast is the correct starting place for about 99% of people. If you have a really, really bad internet connection and a really, really good computer, you might start tinkering with faster. But for most people, you're going to start here with very fast, and you're not going to really mess with that too much. You can override some of these settings in this custom encoder settings, which we will do, or I'll explain how to do it. But you can see all of these settings here. We just leave this as very fast. X264 encoding profile. This only has two options, main and high. And basically this has a few more, it takes a few of these options that the X264 codec has, and either you're allowed to use them or you're not allowed to use them. With main, you're not allowed to mess with them, and with high, you are. The reason this is set to main is because Twitch requires this now. In case you're wondering, the settings that high would allow you to fiddle with are, well, first of all, they're no settings that I've ever actually used. They're not anything important. And they tend to be things that give people issues if they're watching your stream on mobile. And that's the reason why Twitch requires you to have this selected at main. If you have this selected at high, your stream is going to have issues, is going to give mobile people issues if you actually mess with those settings. So just set it at main and leave it there. No reason to mess with that. Keyframe interval. Keyframe interval must be set to 2. What is a keyframe? Basically, a keyframe is every once in a while, your computer is going to send Twitch a perfect frame that has all the information in it. So what you're seeing on my screen right now, my computer is going to send every 2 seconds to Twitch this frame in perfect quality. In between those 2 seconds, I'm not going to send the entire frame. I'm just going to send Twitch information that says, well, you know, this part over here stays the same, but this part changes a little bit, and here's the parameters you need to change it just a bit. So it sends less information, and it works fine. If you've ever seen a stream that was where things were looking kind of blocky for you and the colors were wrong and things didn't look right, and then all of a sudden it just looks perfect again, and then it gets crummy again, and then suddenly it looks perfect, that's because whenever it looks perfect, it just got a keyframe and everything looks great. And then there's something going wrong on the Twitch server or something, and it's not doing the conversions right. This needs to be set to 2 if we're going to mess with Twitch. When we're working with our local recordings, we're going to change this. But for Twitch, must be 2. Use CFR, custom frame rate. I would just leave this checked. There's not really much need to uncheck it. If you uncheck it, then you might see some stuttering. Very, very small stuttering. Not much, but just a bit. Even with a really awesome computer, you may see some micro stutters if you uncheck that. And also, if you're using a program like Sony Vegas to edit, then you have to have that checked. So just leave it there, don't mess with it. And then we get to the custom X264 encoder settings. This is where all the magic happens. This little box here is where we're going to crank up the quality, we're going to mess with stuff, and we can make the stream look real nice, or we can screw things up and make it look terrible. Before we mess with this, I've got a picture I got to show you, which I've got to close this for. We're going to have a warning. So, if you don't know what you're doing and you mess with these settings, you can make your stream look worse, or you can potentially cause a lot of additional stress on your CPU and your RAM. And if anyone tells you, hey, I've got these great encoder settings that are going to work perfectly for you, they're probably wrong. There's no custom settings that work for everyone. There is no magic bullet that's going to work for everybody. So my recommendation is, don't mess with these advanced settings unless you know what they do. And even if you know, when you make changes, test your stream. Check your Performance tab in Task Manager to see what's happening to your CPU and RAM. And if you want to make totally sure everything's great, use a temperature monitoring program. So let me show you that stuff. We open Task Manager. We have Task Manager open, we have Performance open. And as you can see, with my current settings, I'm working on a local recording right now. My CPU usage is hovering about 20%, 25, 20%. And my memory usage is hovering somewhere around 40%. Not a problem. I'm also going to provide a link down in the description to Speccy, which is a temperature monitoring program. I'll run that now. You may not necessarily need Speccy in particular. You may have your own program. But this is going to show you the temperatures in your computer. Now, sharp-eyed people may have noticed, hey, Fake Life, your motherboard says it's 112C, and that seems like a problem. If it actually was 112C, yes, that would be a massive problem. But if you're running a very modern motherboard, most of these programs are going to have issues finding out the temperature of the motherboard. This is not just a problem with Speccy, this is a problem with pretty much any temperature monitoring thing I've tried. Even the BIOS reports it too high. Even the BIOS reports my motherboard at 112 degrees, which is completely impossible given the temperature of all my other parts. The motherboard is actually going to be the coldest. So, if you're in the same position as me, and you open up Speccy or your BIOS in some program and you say, my motherboard's hot enough to boil water, that seems like a problem. It's actually probably not. Don't worry. The more important parts here are our CPU and the RAM, but we can't monitor RAM temperature. Now, as you can see, my CPU is running at about 20% load, and we're at about 35C, somewhere around there. We hover around a bit. If I've tested this before, when my CPU hits max utilization, if it spikes all the way up to 100% here, then my CPU at 100% runs about 50C, which is totally fine because I've got an aftermarket cooler on there and we won't have issues. Now, if you're messing around with advanced settings and you see when your computer goes up to 100C, your CPU's running like 90 or 100, could be a problem. You may not want to mess with those CPU settings. Or if you do, you may want to get some better cooling in your computer. This is normally not a problem. I'm just warning you that you want to keep an eye out for it. A lot of the stuff that I'm showing you and a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is to kind of show you and kind of freak you out a little bit because I want you to get an idea for how you shouldn't mess with these settings without knowing what they're doing. I'm not going to take any responsibility if you mess with these settings and your stream looks like crap and your CPU runs at 90 degrees all the time. So, that being said, let me close these up and we will go back to our settings and we're going to start looking at these encoder settings. If you want to use any custom encoder settings, you got to check this box. That's all there is to that. Now, first things first, rate tall. Rate tall is the one setting that even if you have no idea what you're doing, you are allowed to use rate tall. What rate tall does, you may remember a very, very long time ago, I said that use constant bit rate isn't exactly using this amount of bandwidth, and I would explain why later. It is later. What rate tall does is rate tall gives a percentage that OBS is allowed to go above or below 2500K. So while I'm streaming, obviously since I'm using my local recording profile, it's different. But you would expect that if I set it to 2500K and told it constant bit rate, you would see 2500 here all the time. That's not actually what happens. What happens is it bounces up and down a little bit. Now, the issue you're going to run into is if you're streaming to Twitch, and Twitch says, hey, you said you were running constant bit rate, but you're not. Now, you'll look in here, you'll look in your encoding settings and say, but I've got constant bit rate checked, what's going on? The problem is your rate tolerance is too high, and it's letting it fluctuate so much that Twitch thinks you're not constant bit rate even though you are. The default value is 1. I just put this in here so I remember it's there, basically. And if you want to mess with this, what I would do is if you go to the advanced tabs, tell it to use custom X264 encoder settings and put in rate tall equals 1.0. That is the default. That is what it's already doing even without you telling it. But if you do have issues, take that value instead of 1.0, put in 0.9 and see if you still have issues. If you do, put in 0.8, and if you do, put in 0.7, and so on and so forth until Twitch stops complaining at you. That is what rate tall is used for. Like I said, without any other instruction, this is the one setting that you are allowed to put in and mess with. Sounds good? Then let's move on to the actual hard stuff. me and subme and dblock and RC look ahead and all these other really complex names. I'm going to put a link down in the description, which is going to send you to the X264 settings wiki. What exactly is this? This is every one of these settings that you could possibly put in here and what they do. Note that some of the descriptions here are very complex, and figuring out exactly what these do is hard. I'm going to explain a very small number of them, but if you want to mess with these settings, you gotta learn them. I'm not going to explain every single setting, and if you just start throwing switches and putting in weird numbers, you can cause problems. So do some research. Usually Google will help you out here. You say, Google X264 RC look ahead, and someone will tell you what it does. Okay? First setting, ME. ME is going to determine what types of shapes this encoder is using to detect motion vectors. Once again, I'm being slightly vague because I want you to be a little scared and look these things up yourself. But basically, what that means is when it's what your encoder is going to use to try and detect motion in order to predict what future frames are going to look like. There are a few different settings you can use here. The default setting, if you're using the very fast preset, which I assume you are because I told you to, is hex. The fastest, worst looking setting is DIA, which means diamonds, which is the fastest, lowest quality setting. Hex is in the middle. And then UMH, which I'm using, is the highest one you should practically be using. Hex is hexagons. UMH is a multi-hexagon pattern that catches some of the harder to find motion vectors that just normal hexagons don't. There are a couple of settings higher than UMH, like ESA and TESA. Do not mess with them. They can really increase their CPU load, but they don't do much to improve the quality over what UMH already does. So that's that one. This setting in particular, this can cause a lot of CPU load, but this can really increase the quality of your stream. So if you're going to use this setting, once again, set it here, and then run your stream with Task Manager open and see what's going on with your CPU. If your CPU is pegging out at 100%, then you're going to have issues running that CPU-intensive game you want to stream. So don't just set this. Don't take all this stuff in here and put it in your custom encoder settings and expect it to work for you. Don't you dare do that. If you're going to mess with this, put in your ME equals UMH and then test. Good? Good. SubMe. What exactly is SubMe? SubMe is basically, it's another preset. It's kind of like how we have a preset here which determines stuff. This gives some presets for the ME, the value we have here. And again, we will go to our wiki. And we will find SubMe. I'll just do a search. SubMe. Sub-pistol estimation complexity. And as you can see, there's possible values from 0 to 11 here. And it just tells you exactly what's being done here. This is, again, it's a mess. If you want to know what this does, look it up. That goes beyond this tutorial. I've got it set to 7. If we go to this past tab we had here with the preset preferences, you will see that my SubMe is normally 2 here. I made it 7. So we have using anything less than 2 enables faster, lower quality look ahead, and using higher values increases quality. Again, this costs you CPU. This is more presets. I would not recommend going above 7. I know for sure that like this stuff like 11 and 10 can be ridiculously stressful for not much gain. So if you're going to bump that, put 7 in, and then test it and see what happens. Let's go back here. D-block. D-block sounds nice. What D-block does is D-blocking gets rid of blockiness in your stream when things move too quickly. Sounds good, but there's some problems. If you enable D-blocking, you're going to cause your stream to be a little blurrier. So you want to mess with this a little bit. The values here, the first number is alpha D-blocking, the second number is beta D-blocking. Alpha is basically a measure of how much D-blocking to apply, and beta is a measure of, is this blocky part actually detail that matters, or is it just crap? So in general, the stronger D-blocking you use, you're going to get less blocking, but more fuzziness. So some settings here are going to be really good for fast motion games. Like if you want to play Need for Speed, you're going to want D-blocking. But if I'm playing Blood Bowl, I'm going to turn off D-blocking. Or if I'm playing Hearthstone, Hearthstone's a good example. Very little motion in Hearthstone. I don't care if it blocks, but if I decrease the D-blocking, things are going to look a lot sharper. That text is going to be really readable. And it doesn't matter that, motion, you might see a block here or there because we don't care. So -2, -1. These are my settings for low motion. The maximum numbers you can put in here are 3, but for my low motion games where things don't move around too much, I use -2, -1. If we go over to my high motion games profile, you will see that my D-blocking is 1, 2. So I use 2 separate settings here. I have them saved to separate profiles. That is the only difference between these 2 profiles. If you want just one setting that gives you a good middle ground and you don't want to mess with this stuff too much, use -1:1. That is a good middle ground setting. That's just going to be pretty good for everything. Not the best, but pretty good. Okay? Okay. RC lookahead equals 60. RC lookahead is basically the number of frames that your encoder is going to try and look ahead when it's searching for motion vectors. So we were talking about motion vectors a little bit. This determines how far ahead it tries to look to find motion vectors that might be moving this pixel down here or something like that. You can set this number absurdly high. Don't make it higher than 60. 60 is your max that you are allowed to put in here. You don't get any benefits above 60 realistically. One more important thing to know about this setting, this is more RAM heavy than CPU heavy. So if you're monitoring what's going on in your CPU and your RAM, you want to look at RAM if you're fiddling with RC lookahead. See if your RAM's getting too overloaded. And again, some games are more RAM intensive than others, like the really, really big culprit is Minecraft. If you're running Minecraft and you're already hitting the limit of what your RAM can handle, don't mess with RC lookahead. It's going to use even more RAM. Don't mess with it. B-adapt, B-frames, and ref. This is where things are going to get a little messy. Don't listen to me, do your own research. But if you want to know what they do, B-adapt changes the algorithm that's used for B-frame placement. B-frames are smaller frames that don't carry as much information, so you use less information to generate them, but they can use frames before them and after them to apply motion prediction. I'm not going into too much more detail about the difference between B-frames and P-frames and I-frames and the algorithms and how many B-frames to put in between your P-frames and all that stuff, because it's a mess. There are 2 values here that you can use for B-adapt, really, 1 and 0. 1 is kind of the default. 2 uses a much more aggressive algorithm, and it's super, super, super hard on your computer. It is real rough. So if you want to mess with B-adapt 2, absolutely check and see what's going on with your CPU. B-frames. maximum number of concurrent B frames that can be used. So, like I said, B frames, look at the frames beforehand and afterwards. This tells you how many B frames that you're allowing the encoder to use in a row, one after another. If you're using badapt equals 1, 8 is fine. If you are using badapt equals 2, you do not want to set B frames higher than 5, and I would not go above 3. The settings are different, and like I said, that is a CPU eater. If you're going to mess with B frames and badapt, then do your own research. I'm just telling you, if you're using badapt 1, don't really go above 8, don't mess with that. If you're using bAdaptive 2, don't really go above 3, I would say. And obviously, if you do your own research, you come to your own conclusions, and you want to go higher, more power to you. But I'm not going to say, just set bAdaptive 2 and B frames up to 16 and destroy your computer. Ref, number of previous frames each P frame can use as a reference. B frames are allowed to look back a frame and forward a frame to look for motion. P frames can only go backwards, but ref says how many frames you're allowed to look back with a P frame. So ref of 5 means I can look back 5 frames to do my motion prediction. Again, if you're going to mess with this stuff, do some research. This is where it's starting to get real messy. I mean, if you start, you know you're in the right place when you start looking at big long strings. You do a Google search and you see I, B, P, P, B, 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 P, P, and just a huge mess of letters. It's ugly, it's hard, but if you want to get those little tiny bits out, then feel free to do some research on your own. That I have told you, these are the settings I use. Don't just take my settings, plug them in, and say you're done. Understand what they are. Like if you didn't know what deblocking did and you turned on deblocking and you went to play something like Need for Speed, it would look like shit. You'd have blocking everywhere. Again, if you set RC look ahead and suddenly your Minecraft doesn't want to stream, then that's an issue. So learn what these do. That wiki is good, and there's a million very helpful communities out there that will tell you what this stuff does. Allow 61 to 120 frames per second in video editing. Remember how I told you that 60 frames per second is very, very stressful, much more so than other people think it is. 120 frames per second is ludicrous. You are never going to have enough data to stream your 1080p 120 frames per second, and nobody is going to be able to tell the difference. You can leave this checked if you want to put it in there, but as you recall, in my actual video settings, no. In my actual video settings, my FPS is 30. So I can check that or uncheck it, doesn't matter. Either way is fine, but I'm only putting 30 FPS here. Don't go above 60 FPS, nobody's going to be able to tell and you won't be able to do it. Audio and network. I'm going to tell you the same thing I told in the basic settings. This is debugging, basically. Don't mess with this unless someone who really, really, really knows what they're doing tells you to mess with this, to debug and figure out a problem. We don't mess with this stuff. I mean, when you see the word hack in a checkbox, you don't mess with it. And that is it for the Advanced tab. If you have any other questions, let me know, or go and find out some more research. Go to some websites. Search on Google. The last thing is the Microsoft Noise Gate. You may notice that when I talk, my microphone catches here, so you can see the volume of what I'm talking, and when I stop talking completely like this, the microphone completely shuts off, including all background noise. That's because I'm using a noise gate instead of using a push-to-talk hotkey. You're probably familiar with this kind of thing if you've ever used something like any kind of voice over IP program like Ventrilo or TeamSpeak or Mumble or anything like that. But for the most part, if you want to use a noise gate instead of a push-to-talk hotkey, follow the directions here. So I click on Enable Noise Gate. I left the attack time and the hold time and the release time all the same. And it says a good starting level for thresholds is closed threshold 4 decibels above the loudest noise and open threshold 6 decibels above the loudest noise. Noise basically means the background noise when no one is talking. So when I shut up, it's going to be the level of the bar now. That is the noise level in this room. So we've set our thresholds, and if it gets below the crow's threshold, then everything completely cuts off. If it goes above this threshold, then it opens up. And as a note, while you have this tab open, it doesn't work. So you'll notice right before we entered the screen, I showed you the microphone automatically shutting off, but because I have this tab open, it won't do that anymore. So if I go completely silent, you notice we're still picking up noise. You've seen me use the server ping. If you install any additional OBS plugins, this is where they're going to show up. There's nifty plugins to do all kinds of crazy stuff. Server ping is the only one I use. Microphone noise gate comes with it. And that is it. You now know everything you need to for advanced. That is the big nasty version of everything that can happen in OBS. Okay, this last bit has nothing to do with streaming, but I thought I'd go ahead and throw it in there because it's very useful to know how to make good, high-quality local recordings. If you try using the same settings you've got for streaming to Twitch to make your local recordings, you're going to end up with lower quality stuff, and you're not taking advantage of all the great things that OBS can do for you when you don't have to stick to these rules that Twitch makes you follow. So let's take a look at this. The first thing you need to do, go to broadcast settings and set it to file output only. And give it a place where you want it to put the file. And that's going to make it so we are no longer streaming to Twitch, we are now just saving to a file. That's simple. Now there are two ways of making good local recordings, and I'm going to show you the one I use first, and I'm going to show you the other good way of doing it second. First option, I would recommend whatever you decide to do for your local recordings, I would create a new profile for it, because we're going to mess with a lot of settings that Twitch is not going to like if we try to use them again for Twitch. So go ahead and make a new profile for local recordings. Go to encoding. You're going to notice some pretty big differences already. We can uncheck this constant bitrate because we don't have to use constant bitrate. We can stick it to the man and use whatever bitrate we want. Quality balance. Set it up to 10. No reason not to at this point. Custom buffer size. We're going to leave that unchecked for this first method. We are going to check it for the second one, but for now we're going to leave it unchecked. Max bit rate, go ahead and put in a big number there like 50K. Because this is no longer, we're not sending data to a server anymore. We don't have to rely on our upload speed. This is just determining how big the file is going to be. And realistically, since we're not using constant bitrate anymore, OBS knows better than to use 50 kbps on a mostly still screen of Calvin and Hobbes here looking at my OBS stuff. So as you can see, we're using like 500 to 1,000 of the 50,000 that I've allocated. So everything's fine. You can go ahead and crank up the audio. I don't think there's much of a point to go up beyond 192, but if you're a crazy audiophile and you want to make it go up even higher, you can do that. Changed our broadcast settings already. Video. We can set the video to 1080p. So resolution downscale, we are doing none. We have no filter because we are not downscaling, and FPS can be 60. Audio, we don't mess with. Advanced. A few things get changed here. We still don't mess with anything here aside from above normal for our process priority class. We still use very fast. Encoding profile, we can use high. It doesn't matter. We're not messing with those settings anyway. Keyframe interval. We are now going to set keyframe interval to 0 instead of 2. If we set it to 0, basically we are telling OBS, you don't just have to send a keyframe every 2 seconds. Whenever you feel like it, whenever you think it's most useful, send a keyframe. So we're going to let OBS do its job. We're still going to use constant frame rate, because there's no reason not to. And again, if you're using something like Sony Vegas, you need this checked. Custom encoder settings. For this first method, we are not using any custom encoder settings. We just gave OBS 50,000 K to work with and said, go to it. Allow 61 to 120 frames per second entry in video settings. You could, but again, there's really no point in putting anything more than 60 FPS up, so I wouldn't recommend it. And other stuff stays the same. And those are the settings I am using to get this video recording right here. The second way of doing this is still don't use a constant bitrate, still use quality balance of 10, but use a custom buffer size. And for the custom buffer size, we are going to put in 0. What 0 means is we are letting OBS do whatever it wants to with the buffer. It can put any number there it wants. So we'll set that there. Just imagine that I leave these settings the same. The broadcast settings are the same, video's the same, still setting it to 1080p, no resolution downscale, no filter, 60 FPS. Advanced. If you are giving it actually using the custom buffer and setting it to 0, you need to use this custom X264 encoder setting, CRF. CRF is going to determine the compression rate. And it goes from 20 at the worst to 0 at the best. And by 0, I mean lossless. There is no compression going on whatsoever. The file you are going to spit out with CRF equals 0 is going to be massive, but you can do it. Now, for practical purposes, I would start at a number like 20 or 15, because even though those numbers sound bad because they're near the bottom end of the scale, they're still going to give you really good results. Like, as you can see, I put in CRF 15, and I can guarantee you if I ran the exact same recording using these settings instead of the ones I normally use, it would still look great. So that's going to take a little bit of fiddling. I would not start any higher than 15, and you're going to get a feel for how big of files it's going to make. Part of the reason I'm using the profile that I am using is because I know that I'm recording a still desktop. I don't need a lossless recording for a desktop where basically my mouse pointer and little windows are changing every once in a while. So I'm giving it 50k bitrate, I'm not using a custom buffer, and it barely needs to use any of that. But if you do this, you're going to get a nice file saved, and it's going to look real great. And that's all there is to it. Just remember, I would recommend you set up a different profile for your local recordings so you don't have to keep changing all these settings back and forth and getting errors in the broadcast settings tab because you forgot to change the keyframe interval back to 2 instead of 0 and stuff like that. But that's all there is to it. And pick one of those two methods, set it up, tinker with it a little bit, and you should have really, really nice looking local recordings. And that is it for this tutorial. You should have all the information you need if you want to just get a stream up and running to show your friends a neat little game, or if you want to tinker with your stream and have the best looking stream on the web. I'm Fake Life. That's the end of this tutorial. If you have any more questions, go ahead and post them in the comments and I'll get to them as best I can. Or if you have really advanced questions, like you started looking at those custom encoder settings and you want to start messing with stuff but you don't know what to do, you can ask on the OBS forums, and there's people who know far, far more than I do who will be able to answer any questions you've got. If you like this video, go ahead and click on that subscribe button or leave me a like, and check out the other stuff in this channel to see if anything looks interesting. And that's all I got. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.